Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in this episode, I sat down with Liz Arthur. Liz is the global head of enterprise strategy at Earn DLT. Earn is all about bringing trust, transparency, and transactability to environmental data. In this episode, Liz and I discussed things like the importance of validated data and also some of the challenges and the issues around how we think about bringing value and transactability to environmental data in the commodity space. Make sure you like or subscribe to the podcast so that you can see any upcoming episodes. And I really hope that for now you enjoy my discussion with Liz. Thanks. Hi, welcome to the Navigating Carbon podcast. I'm Deb Ryan, and today I'm joined by Liz Arthur from Earn DLT. Liz, how are you?
Cannot complain. It's a perfect fall day in Denver, Deb.
It
Cannot
really is.
complain.
Yep.
And one of my favorite topics, carbon management. So thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I'm really excited today to dive into really the value of carbon intensity verification and what that looks like, challenges that we're seeing in the market, and thinking about the importance of data and validated data and where this sector of the space is really moving. So really excited for this conversation today. So really grateful that you could be here. So I wanted to kind of start with letting you kind of give the audience a bit of an overview about who Earn is, and which kind of piece of the market you guys are looking at.
It is an elusive, evolving piece of the market, but one that is near and dear to my heart. But historically, I started in upstream oil and gas almost 20 years ago. So definitely have a love for this industry and specifically what natural gas operators are going through right now, especially in the US. We have changing regulation, we have these pulls from private equity companies, and then we have this want for we're building this data set, like what is that value in the market and what does it look like? And only a couple years ago, when I really was immersed in the space of more emissions data management, did I really learn all the intricacies and how siloed we are, whether we're siloed between upstream and midstream and the downstream market, or even within companies, how that sustainability team and air is speaking a different language than a commercial or a marketing team. And I really fell in love with that commercial marketing side. And that is when I started working with Earn a couple years ago when I was still with Project Canary, that this idea of leaning into scope one data, whether something is certified or not certified, what does that look like in the market? So Earn really focuses on that piece. We do not measure, we do not calculate, but we have data pushed to us, primary data, and we're really could identify as an EAC registry, so an energy attribute certificate registry. We're blockchain, we can also identify that way, but it is a way to perfectly transact that primary data in a validated manner throughout the entire supply chain. And if you follow anything I've been doing, I joke we're a nutrition label for that molecule, whether it's a molecule of gas or a molecule of methanol, we're that nutrition label for what that primary data is for a given product.
Yeah, and I think there's so much there to unpack that I think is really important. Things around asset for companies in terms of their scope one, but how that fits within a life cycle when you're looking at, you talked about how do we move through from upstream to midstream to downstream and really follow the emissions on the life cycle as opposed to a company's individual asset. So that's kind of a really big piece in terms of how do we think about carbon intensity. So can you kind of pull that piece apart a little bit and the importance of putting that life cycle together with individual companies' primary data or their scope one, measured, calculated data?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's good to also talk about what we find ourselves chatting about a lot as well, which is methane intensity. And so methane intensity had a big spotlight shown on it between changes in subpart W and quad OB. But methane intensity has never been that driver when you're talking about the commercial side of making an impact, but carbon intensity does. And so I think to your point, it's good to pause and say, why is carbon intensity the new queen of the castle? But when you're really working backwards, which is so important to be a good listener, and in this space of supply chain, work backwards from a buyer, we're talking about a buyer's life cycle analysis and the way that they report to GHG protocol what that carbon intensity is. And right now, that data is shared in a very unvalidated manner. If I'm a chemical producer, Deb, I'm so excited about buying your gas. What is your carbon intensity? And you're sharing that data where we know it's important because I need to know what it is, but it's through an email, it's through a spreadsheet. I don't know if it's going to work with my ultimate reporting standard. So I think the idea that we're moving beyond disclosure, we're moving beyond transparency. And if I actually want to make a carbon reduction as that ultimate owner of those attributes or carbon intensity, or actually create a carbon inset, then I need something validated that works with a given global standard. And that's why carbon intensity is so key for me to actually make that reduction and not just say, I love that I know this, or this is what, Deb is saying she represents. To make that reduction in an LCA, it has to be validated and there has to be some standard that we're measuring against. And that part has been extremely complicated and very gray in the space.
Yeah.
It just has not been a space that's been black and white up to now, but why it's so impactful at the end of the day.
And that, for a company in terms of their primary data, when we talk about primary data, we're talking about the data that the companies are collecting themselves. And again, you've sort of mentioned this from lots of different sources. Like there's no one solution out there. There's lots of different ways for us to calculate and estimate methane, like you talked about, but other kind of carbon sources through the supply chain, of course, which methane is one of, but not all of them. So, like, as you guys have, been going along this journey of methane to carbon intensity and looking at that demand side, like you talked about, with say a chemical producer trying to understand their emissions and their carbon intensity all the way back to maybe the gas they're buying from upstream. Like, how have you seen that evolution and the importance of validated data really evolve? And where do you think that's heading?
So much to unpack there. I
Yeah.
mean, it's happening because of pushes where we have to look at things differently. So we talk a lot about the EU methane regs. We talk a lot about CBAM. I talk a lot now about product carbon footprint, like the PCF, in a way that I didn't when I was strictly just thinking about gas as a commodity on the upstream side. Because let's talk about Europe for a minute. Because those regulations they're happening. If I am a nutrition label, Europe is on a carbon diet. And the only time in my life I've really, really paid attention to a nutrition label is when I have to pay attention where I was, counting protein. It didn't last for long, but when counting macros or whatever it was, like I needed that information and I needed to believe what was on the label. So I think one, it's understanding there's a spectrum of buyers. We work with everything from utilities to industrial and really leaning into LNG, and chemical is another big one. There are big drivers if you're an EU chemical company that are not possible or just different from a utility right now in the US with cost recovery. So I think understanding where that buyer is and asking about scope 3 needs. Like if you are a buyer, if you have an aggressive scope 3 goal, hey, we're above and beyond by 2025 or by 2030 or 2040, we're trying to get here. That means you need a strategy where you're looking at not just gas, but your entire feedstock. How can we get here? How can we be efficient with money? How can we be scalable in what we're asking for? And so by leveraging that primary data, by helping lower that carbon intensity, where something before like natural gas was just gas is gas and it was tied to some default value, you create room and space to play in your feedstock where maybe you buy a little less RNG. I love RNG, or a few less offsets, love offsets. But it's having the power to look at your full feedstock and take advantage of an operator's scope 1 to meet that scope 3 goal. And I think we've been seeing that over time with some good leading operators, and we're continuing in that path now with some of these regulations changing.
And I think one of the evolutions that, and I know you and I have talked about this before, and it's something that I've definitely seen over the past few years, this evolution from, operators and producers of commodities, whether it's an oil and gas company or, coal company or an iron ore company, doesn't matter, where they've been claiming and making claims and statements about the carbon intensity of what they're producing. But really, we've really seen this dynamic shift where it's actually now the buyers actually asking for that information. We're starting to see that pull and asking for the receipts, like you said, like really trying to make sure that the claims that are being made are valid. And that's really important in this. If this is going to work, it's such a critical step. And something I think Earn is really starting to unlock in terms of what that means and what that looks like.
No, absolutely. And that the supplier part is really key. Like I've been more focused on the buy side, but what we're really doing is changing that narrative. Okay, what tools can I give you where you can ask your suppliers, this is my sustainability, this is our mission, this is the data I'm looking for to help and really help grow that bridge where it's just been, I will take the best that you give me. What data do you have? And taking it at face value. And by doing that and by helping the downstream be very intentional about what they're asking for and confident in what they're asking for, it will help everyone on that natural gas side of the feedstock by delivering and actually knowing what they have to deliver. And I think that part is hard. We're almost on the upstream midstream side paralyzed by choice. Like, am I choosing the right company? Do you have value in these attributes? Am I doing it the right way? Like, what is enough? And so by really educating and working with some really sophisticated buyers, we've done a number of deals with ProMan on the methanol side. Now they've minted their own methanol tokens. We're now working with Evonik, who's a step downstream from them with other chemicals, by really leaning into them and understanding how are you asking this information from your suppliers, and building that bridge, I think, is a very scalable and useful tool that will help everyone on the upstream side.
Yeah. And you mentioned briefly in passing, the EU methane regs. And I think it's worth kind of unpacking that a little bit. And it's sort of why I believe it's why we've seen this shift in the buyers really demanding this information from their suppliers, essentially the producers of commodities. So yeah, can you kind of unpack that for folks in terms of like, what is the methane EU rules that we're seeing, and how has that shifted this market?
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a call for the receipt, as you call it, moving towards more site level, getting more granular than basin level where we have been, and understanding emissions, understanding sources. I think it's going to happen gradually. Like, it really lays out over the next couple years what are the tools available and how are we going to move through that disclosure. And I think on this commercial side of the market, understanding really the way natural gas from the US is getting into Europe is through other products. It's through, LNG, it's through hydrogen and methanol and ammonia, and through these other products into the EU, where there is going to be that demand for, what is this and what does it look like and what do those emissions look like. And so I think it's going to be, first of all, gradual over the next couple years as it's laid out, but two, definitely a call for action of, emission factors are not going to be enough. On that threshold of what is enough, looking more than basin wide, looking more than what we've had to do in the past for subpart W, and really give more information, especially into these, building blocks chemicals where most of that gas moves into the EU. I think it's going to be critical not only for those methane regs, but for things like CBAM, where natural gas is not on that initial list for carbon border adjustment mechanism, but we know that list is going to grow.
Yep.
And so those buyers that we're working with say, hey, the list is this long. We know we want to get ahead of it, and we know it's only going to get longer. So the more that we know for that product carbon footprint, the more we know from what we're importing, absolutely the better.
Yeah. And I think, again, so much there, like because the methane rule in Europe that says that companies have to show what their MMRV, so their measuring, monitoring, reporting, and verification process looks like. It's actually not just for gas, it's for all fossil fuels being imported into Europe. So oil, gas, and coal. So the US is actually one of the most impacted countries. It sends a lot of its oil, a lot of its gas through LNG and other products like you talked about to Europe. Not as much coal as other places, but it is one of the countries that's really impacted. And I think the point that you talk about where, historically we maybe had the information on, say, the Permian Basin level or, here in Colorado, the DJ Basin level isn't going to be enough because we have to go back all the way to that supply chain and say, where did that gas or that oil actually come from? And I think one of the things I'd love to get your take on is, we've often heard, I think, from some of the smaller companies that they don't think this is going to impact them because maybe they're not selling to LNG or they're not doing that. But I think this is where we're going to see a shift where it is going to impact more companies than people sort of think, because it is going back to individual wells, individual supply, and being able to track that supply chain. Do you agree with that?
No, I do. It's really hard because I think about myself. I, started at Chesapeake proudly, drilling the Barnett. And those years 2007, 2008, this was not we did not talk about this space the way that we do now, where the past 5 years companies have had to create budgets for this and then figure out, is the ROI existing? Is it beyond social license to operate? Is it staying in compliance? Or then this idea of the commercial market? Those are all different agendas, but all worthy and valid depending where you're operating. But it also leaves the door open if you are an operator with incredible practices, and there are so many that go above and beyond, not just the US, but all our Canadian friends who've had a lot of regulations to answer to as well. Then how do you highlight and leverage that data that you have and really open those doors for yourself to say, I'm more than willing as a supplier to give this to you? And even more importantly, I see this in transport right now. I have incredible hydrogen producers that I would love something better than the defaults in the GREET model. Are there companies out there that are representing fractionation or representing transport that are sitting on this data? We're dying for it. And midstream is not even a mitigated risk, but as a regulated pipeline, they are my no risk friends, but they are sitting on this great data. So I think connecting those dots and really making it a worthy story where it's all about the data and coming forward, you really can differentiate yourself, or you can choose to resist. But those companies that are really leaning into it, they are going to be ahead of this market, and they are going to, I truly believe, have preference as a supplier with some of these really sophisticated scope 3 reporting companies. But I wish it weren't so cultural, but there is an option of, do I have to, or who's going to make me? And that's okay. All's fair in love and MMRV.
Yeah. Well, and I think as well, here in the US, it potentially, because we're seeing this idea of differentiation and being a preferred supplier, I think the idea of carbon intensity becoming an attribute of the gas, the LNG, the crude, whatever it is such, something that I've obviously been looking at and talking about for a long time. But I think, for companies that are just looking at this as a cost, oh my goodness, we need to think about, putting in all this extra staff, all this extra monitoring. But, the idea of then differentiating that potentially has value. And I think that's something that, you guys are starting to unlock as part of this. So can you sort of talk about that a little bit as well in terms of like, what does this mean in terms of a premium?
Yeah, that is the question that everybody wants to know. And at these conferences, there's always a, so what does this look like? I mean, you're right. It is an investment on the front end, and it's not an easy one. Finding the right technology that works for a basin. It's if you're in the Haynesville and there's humidity, that's different. If you're in the San Juan Basin, it's different. If you're in the Marcellus, so I think there are struggles in just, are you in compliance? Are you doing what you need to do, and kind of swallowing that pill of, yes, it is an investment, but look where that disclosure gets you a step beyond. And then when it comes to a premium, I mean, again, let's go back to that, that life cycle analysis and where you have to pen in that carbon intensity. Really ideally, and I know we've talked about this a lot too over the years, like this should come down to some price of carbon, and that validated primary data giving that buyer the ability to substitute that default number for something lower, where that really should be where your premium comes from, not the idea that, Deb, you're a wonderful operator with great practices and you deserve an extra nickel. It really should come down to the math of carbon management, where if you are saving on offsets, buying less RNG, which is beautiful and carries that really low carbon intensity, but harder to find and comes in smaller batches, that there is a way where that primary data, along with the volume of gas, is worthy of some extra cents per MMBTU. Yep. And the idea that this is not only possible, but it's traceable for the life cycle of that molecule in the supply chain is really what we're hanging our hat in. That quantified emissions token of natural gas might grow up to be methanol and sodium methylate someday, but that footprint is always there. No matter what happens to these companies, to the humans that did these trades, that footprint is there. And we really, moving forward, I know the price of carbon, it's one of those things. If we had a room with 20 of our friends, we could get 20 different answers, but want to continue to strive to make sure this is something that can be forward scheduled, that can be scalable to other products, and really tie it to the price of carbon going forward. And that's really where that premium should come from.
Yeah. And then, diving in a little bit on the idea of like monetizing certificates and tokens and some of that kind of stuff. Like, how have you seen that space evolve? Like when you and I very first started looking at some of this space, everyone was talking about certified natural gas here in the US, and what that looked like and stuff. And I think we have seen this evolution of certificates. You guys are looking at tokens and the value that kind of comes from some of that as well. So can you kind of talk about that a little bit as well?
Absolutely. I mean, all the acronyms, Deb, started with certified, I still love the idea of a third party assessment and those attributes. So, love the relationship with MIQ as really the certifier in the space. But yes, it changed from, responsibly sourced gas. We don't want to shame anybody that doesn't, to differentiated, to now we have this space of maybe it is certified, and maybe we do have those additional attributes and that value of disclosure. And then moving on to this other space where you do have, the Project Canary and the Envanas and the Context Labs of the world with all these amazing measurement companies that are leaning more into the data side and reconciliation and carbon intensity, where maybe it's not certified, but it doesn't mean that that data doesn't have immense value. So I really encourage people to move away from the stamp of just certified or not certified. It's not better or worse. I absolutely think that that volume of gas within that certified space can be used this way. It can be tokenized. And it's really about how can we dig down and make it more and more granular, talk more about carbon intensity, talk more about site level over basin level, but also be open that there are ways of carbon intensity being calculated, again, leading into existing global standards and putting that validation on it, which is still very worthy in the marketplace. So it is that stamp, I think, is it's changed and evolved because it's not just the stamp that makes a carbon reduction, but I will always support disclosure and the idea of the power of a third party assessment with other environmental attributes. But moving forward, as our friend Kelly Bott would say, data, data, data. This is a data, data, data game, and how you can leverage that data in a really smart, scalable way to help our Scope 3 reporting buyers.
Yeah, very cool. So, in closing up, like in an ideal world, we've obviously seen a lot of evolution in this space, even in the last few years. Where do you see the market growing, evolving? What do you think is next?
If only if I was really good with my magic 8 ball, I wish I could say, but this is going to be my guess, and we can have a glass of wine 3 years from now and see what's going on. I hope that we grow into this space where primary data is as easy as saying, yes, do you want to buy? Do you need a bag checking out at the market, or did you bring your own? Like, yes or no to primary data. And that choice of asking for primary data with a product triggers these other things, and these spaces of value is almost like a price reduction mechanism, or what that data can be used for. So I think having primary data widely attainable is my wish for our future. I think it's also to fill in places where we know are so important to US industry. How do we make and open up doors for LNG? How do we open up doors for data centers where they're definitely the hot new girl in the cafeteria right now? And that is a game of looking at more than what feedstock from where that power comes from. I think helping back electricity and just power in general is going to be so important as well. And making more bridges to our European friends and the Asian market as they come up and create some of these standards as well for Asia Pac. But having primary data readily accessible in a way that will build bridges that have not existed right now, in a way that mitigates risk, is really what I hope EARN can lean into, and what I really hope the market is open to as all of these regulations and changes happen, which some of it is really important. I know it feels like a lot of noise, but leaning into the data and being able to kind of push back the curtains on noise is really where I hope we're going.
No, I love that. So, Liz, with that, thank you so much for joining me today and for taking us through really the value of carbon intensity and where we're heading with that. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope you are always the nutrition label to go along with your compass.
Love it.
Thank you.